Welcome to the podcast today. We're going to continue our conversations because they were so successful a couple weeks ago when Michael and I sat down and he started asking me questions about what it's like to be an exorcist and how does that feel to an engineer. So, Michael, welcome to the show today.
Hey, thanks. Hey, it wasn't 2 weeks ago. It was Friday.
I have a temporal distortion in my
I
brain.
guess.
As you know, there's the singularity that I never know usually even what
I
year it
know.
is, let alone day or month. But that actually comes along with all of this. It's
Mm.
when you are able to witness spacelessness, timelessness, then it's real hard sometimes to come back and make sure you know what day it is and show up to appointments on time.
I've
But anyway,
noticed.
we had such great
Just kidding.
responses. Yes, we had such great responses last time and so many good questions that I think today will be answering some of those questions that people ask because you read the responses too. And so we'll move forward. And basically, people just love the fact that you are such a clear thinker that you're going to make me actually get articulate about things that I just assume everybody knows.
Well, when you've told me these things in the past, I've let them go by because I had too many questions. So now I'm going to make you slow down if you would. And by the way, I really appreciate you sharing this. These are some intimate details that I can imagine. Well, they make me uncomfortable asking them, and I know that some of the comments were it made other people uncomfortable, and it's really all about what you're willing to share and not share. And I think you said something really profound on Friday. You said, if I'm not willing to share, then what? I can't pass on the blessing that I've received, or what did you say? I forget.
I think that's true. If and people said, it took a lot of courage for both of us to do this. Yes, it does. And in this whole series that John Barnwell and you were both involved in, it's probably the most difficult thing that I've done in these last 5, 6, 7 years in terms of sharing with the public some things that I experienced when I was younger, and especially sharing my biography. Plus, it's very difficult to call up some of these things because a lot of this stuff was accompanied by severe trauma. And
Hmm.
that's some of the remarks that we got from people. They said, "Oh my gosh, those kind of things happened to me when I was young." And so they were just so encouraging to please continue to so that they could, have their reference point with another person who has suffered. And, I always like to use Steiner's phrase, suffering crystallizes into wisdom. That's
Hmm.
if you're lucky. Sometimes it
Yeah.
doesn't crystallize at all, and it's just plain old suffering. But yes, this is it's not anything that I've ever bragged about. It's not anything I've ever talked about. I've never written about it. And so I'm glad to do this because we got to see that so many people are so appreciative of what John and you are doing with these conversations. So,
Well, I don't want to make you uncomfortable. So if there's something I ask that you don't want to go into, please just say that.
oh
Uh,
no, don't worry. But
but
yeah, there are scary things that I may not give, 100% full descriptions of because the things that lead people to be possessed are the most horrible things that you can imagine. And so we had to ferret that out and with in some of these cases, but they'd come to Father William and I into the psych ward. And so they had been under medical care, psychiatric care. And so we could get the history that would help us understand some of these things. But then again, a lot of the people in the psych ward, nobody considered them to be possessed or obsessed or anything. They thought that they had some mental illness or some physiological illness that made them look like they had mental illness.
Douglas, I wanted to go back to the time after you were 7 to 9, if you don't mind, and up to the time that you met Father William and formally started getting involved in exorcisms and being the father of children. One of the things you always are concerned about as your children grow older and become self aware is that they're having all the right influences in their lives so that they form properly. And as they get older, you as a parent can control less and less of that. And I'm curious to hear what you say about, since you could see more of the activities of the unseen world as you grew up and became a teenager. Um, how did you, as a young 11, 12, becoming a teenager at 13, how did you deal with all these things you could see? And did any of those demonic influences or the angelic influences affect you in unique ways where you actually would have recommendations for parents as to how they help their children in their spiritual formation?
That's a wonderful question, especially in light of the fact that so many people said that they've had similar experiences when they were young and then they were blotted out by the time they got older. I recommend that when your children come to you and say they see this and they see that, that you completely honest with them and say, well, I might not see that, but that you see it, I reaffirm that. I believe you. I support you. And what they did to me was they sent me to psychiatrists and they put me in special education and they said that something was seriously wrong
Mm,
with me. And so, for me, it was a bit traumatic. So with a parent, with a child who may have those abilities, and now we call them star children, they call them indigo children. Um, I call them wisdom children. And if you can, you try to get them a curriculum that shows them that in the ancient past, everyone had those experiences. I mean, look at the Bible. The prophets had angels appear to them. They had God speak to them in a burning bush. They had all these experiences. And had they had modern parents, they would have told them they were crazy. You don't want to
mm,
tell your child they're crazy. Now, most children, and there's a difference between having what is called an elemental friend and having multiple personality disorder, which they accuse me of having. I didn't talk about my elemental friends because I knew that by that time people didn't see them because they'd be standing right there next to me. Though I have met many people that the second they met me, they said, you have an elemental being standing behind you.
is that
This
right?
is very common
Mm.
even as adults. And these were people who generally didn't see such things. So I say that the advice I'd give to parents is let your child understand that you will hear whatever it is they have to say and that you will hear it in an unbiased manner and that you'll support them.
And it sounds like you didn't get much of that.
I got zero of that.
Wow.
And even, we were Catholics and I couldn't say to my parents, don't you see the angel on the altar? Don't you see the spirit descending upon the consecration of the Holy Eucharist as it was happening? No, I couldn't say that to them. And when things have appeared, for instance, the most haunted place in my town, this is a funny story for you. The children, because I really played with the children a lot. Committed not to ever get married and have children. And so I really loved my brother's children. And they would say to me, well, let's go do something really fun. And because you have such abilities, they knew some of that. They'd say, take us to the most haunted house. So I took them to this most haunted place that I think I've ever encountered. And as I said, bring your camera because we're going to take pictures of these ghosts. And so we went there and I'd say, okay, right here, you see that? Okay, take a picture of that right now. And they take a picture and I would say, what is there is this. And then they'd look at the picture when they got them later and they'd see that, in fact, that spirit had manifested and left an imprint that would appear on the film. So when you have people who are in disbelief, you can take them to those experiences, and guess what? They're still not going to believe it
Mm,
even when they have the photographic record that the emulsion, and I predicted exactly what would happen. The emulsion will be overexposed and you will see very, very blacker than black imprints. And I said, oh, right here, you can see the spirit just jump through that wall and his feet landed there. Can you see the glowing feet? And they'd go, no. I said, take a picture right here. And I'd point right at it. They take a picture, it'd show up on the film, and they'd still disbelieve it. So It's you expect to have disbelief because this is the age of materialism, and unfortunately, the old natural clairvoyance that gave religions the experiences with saints and prophets that are talked about, people think, well, that's exclusive just for saints and prophets. No, it's not. And though we have lost a lot of that, some people are born with that and they bring it in for a variety of reasons. We haven't yet discussed that. But when you find somebody who's really psychic, like, mind you, I have been responsible for the education of 10,000 students a year in my last job, and many of those students were what should extraordinary. They were different. They were everything from psychic to sociopaths to people who had X-rays coming out of their head and they could hypnotize you and make you do things. But did my staff notice that? No, I had a staff of 250 people, and they didn't notice that anybody was special. So when we got really unusual children in, it was usually it was my responsibility. I felt responsible to go interview those children and see if I could help them and let them know that they were in a place where at least some people understood what they were going through. And it's amazing once they find that someone can do that with them,
Mhm.
it can really heal a lot of the trauma that they have experienced for their entire life when they have just one person. For instance, when I met Father William, that was it. I mean, thank heavens, I finally found somebody who didn't think that I was, a weird freak, and it
Had
was
you
such
been
encouragement.
conscious had you been consciously seeking him out or somebody like him? Or
I
or it when it happened, you just knew it?
No, I had been seeking people out like that. Anybody who could understand that, they say a saint knows a saint, a clairvoyant knows a clairvoyant, a robber knows a robber, a thief knows a thief, these kind of things. And so I would all the time try to find priests, or later on when I was older, when I met Father William, we went around to all the churches just to check them out and to check out the revivals that were going on in the tents in Springfield and all this stuff. Because what were we doing? We were looking for kindred souls. And
Mhm.
oftentimes when we'd find them, it would be just a wonderful, beautiful experience. And it is absolutely necessary because until that time, I really did think that I was kind of just a freak and I couldn't understand why.
Hmm. So, what would be your recommendation to a parent who has these things going on with their child? Should they seek out assistance, or uh, just
I'd
pray a
seek out,
lot, or what?
yeah, spiritual assistance that you go to, your spiritual leader of your church. You go to somebody who is already stating that they are clairvoyant, and then you can see if they can have communication with this child. But what you don't want to do is go tell the psychiatrist that the child isn't, the child psychologist will say, or psychiatrist will say, they are involved in magical thinking. In other words, completely dismissing that what they're experiencing is real.
Mhm.
And that is very harmful. And then just, many children have an elemental friend. What is that? They are at an early age, especially the earlier and the younger they are, they may be experiencing beings who are elemental beings that we would call, gnomes and sylphs and sprites and salamanders and nixies and these kind of things. And when they start telling their parents about it, their parents, think that, it's an illness. And that is the worst thing that you can do. And now, normally, because I was a teacher for a long time, and a superintendent and a principal. And when children had these experiences, I would sit down with them and listen to what they have to say, make no judgment whatsoever. And if I could, because I could see these things, I might say to them, "Well, you do know that your friend, that you're calling whatever, they're with you now because you're young, and they might not be there later. So don't be worried if one day they go off and don't come back. That's okay too, because basically, you can turn that same love that you had for that elemental being, uh, you can give that to human beings. And you may grow out of it, you may not grow out of it, because you can't tell. I mean, a child who's very clairvoyant when they're young, there's reasons for that. And the worst thing you can do is what is often done with what they call star children, indigo children, all these different names. They think that the child is now their spiritual teacher. Do not put that on a child. Don't ever put that on a child where
Wait, you
you,
mean the parent thinks that of the child?
yes, New
Oh,
Age
wow.
parents think that a star child is clairvoyant and that they're their teacher and that they came there to teach the parents, and then they deify them. They actually make
Mm.
them into, somebody that they worship, and then they start to put so much pressure on the child that the child is supposed to be bringing messages from the spiritual world. All children bring messages from the spiritual world. There's no such thing as a child, especially infants. And anybody who knows me
So
knows that I
a young
love
child
infants.
a young child will have a lot of activities related to make believe, and they make up stories and they play in that vein. Is that the same thing as what you're saying, or is that something infants do just as a normal course, and later on is when you see you talking about these elemental beings? Does that come later?
You know how you see a child when they're young, very young, they seem to be playing with invisible people.
Hmm.
Some of that's real, some of that's not real. But if they have a elemental being that is with them when they're in their 9 to 10 year change, between 9 and 10, the child goes through a massive change where they go from being completely subjective to beginning to be objective. So if that elemental friend, there's many names for those kind of beings, but if that elemental friend continues past age 10, then you should start to take the child quite seriously that they are in contact with the unseen world. If it leaves at around 9 and 10 when they go through this change, which it's a classic change that all children go through, they go through it more dramatically if they're the firstborn child. And if they're the firstborn child, they will classically go through the scenario that they want to run away from home. They don't believe that their parents are their real parents. They believe that their real parents are a king and a queen somewhere off in another kingdom that they need to go to. And then when they can't, they may, or when they want to, they pack up their bag and they run away from home. So what you do is you just let them do that and follow behind them, keep an eye on them. And if they're very, very serious,
Sorry.
if they're very, very serious, then they may not turn around and come back home, and then you should get concerned. But they also, many parents will know this, especially if you've had a few children. The first child will start talking about death at that 9 to 10 year change. That is not the concern of suicide, or that doesn't come from depression. That is completely natural. When you go from being subjective, completely subjective, you believe that your parents are part of your world and that everything in the world is part of you, and that's completely natural. But when you become objective, you have to basically step back and start to look at the world differently, and you notice that you, as a child, have a subjective world and an objective world. And so their parents were always there as part of your environment, like furniture. But when you become objective, you need to basically reestablish your relationship with your parents and try to understand it. And the child will go through basically having to relearn everything they learned in the grades below the usually third or fourth grade that they're in when they go through this change. And so it's so funny because in a Waldorf school, we would teach the children, one teacher stays with them from first through eighth grade. And so I had all these children when they reached fourth grade, and we started to do fractions. As soon as you start to do fractions, oh my gosh, the child has to become objective, right? Because they really can't quite figure out the world is one whole to them until then.
Mm.
And so you start fractioning up things. They're like, oh my goodness, then I'm a fraction. My subjective and objective, and how do they fit together? So the child goes through this classic scenario of saying, Mr. Gabriel, you never taught me how to do my times tables. My sister taught me last night. So all the years I'd spent teaching them rhythmic counting and all this, teaching them fractions and so on and so forth. At a certain point, overnight, they relearn it from an objective point of view, and go through this change. And it can really worry parents. I mean, I can't tell you how many parents have come crying to me in a third or fourth grade. And I look at them and I say, I know what you're going through. Have a seat. And they go, how can you know what I'm going through? Let's see. Your child tried to run away and then said she's going to kill herself. And they'll go, oh, how can you know that? Because there's a first child. The second child may not do that. Third child may not do that. Fourth child may do it because there's a rhythm of three: first, second, third child scenario. First child follows what the parents want. Second child rejects it. Third child watches the first and second and does whatever they want. Fourth child is again a first child. So the first child has so much pressure on them that when they go through this change, they will look as if they are going from what we would call the old ancient natural clairvoyance to being objective in the material world. And it's a terrible experience for a child. And it's just like what I was saying before. You just have to be there for the child. You have to listen. Don't take them to doctors, materialistic doctors and psychiatrists who are going to make up some kind of nonsense. And
Is this where they start using, the psychiatrist may start using drugs
oh, yes,
to
absolutely.
drug it out of them?
Oh, yes. They'll give them
Mm.
psych drugs. And psych drugs, I really can't think of a time that psychological drugs did anybody any good. So you want to
Mm.
avoid that, especially with children. And whatever you do, don't believe the educators who tell you your child has attention deficit disorder
ADD,
or ADHD, HD,
ADHD. Yeah.
attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Complete nonsense. It depends on their age. If they're 9 to 10, that's completely normal, and they oftentimes look that way. But to give a child Adderall or to give them Ritalin or these kind of things, that's a horrible thing that will cause big problems later. And in many cases, the second you give a child psych drugs, they'll hallucinate at first, and then they will become deeply materialistic afterwards because their ability to perceive the spiritual world will actually be eradicated by those drugs.
Is that right? So I was just going to ask you about that. So how does that, if they're on drugs, or if you were on drugs at that time, um, how did you perceive this this angel world, this demon world? Did you just go blank? Were you ever on drugs and when that happened?
They did in those days. They didn't give children those kind of drugs. There was no such thing as ADD, ADHD, ADHD, or any of those things. No, they just said that you were crazy and go to special ed. And if they're sleepwalking, don't wake them up and humor them. They'd often just tell you, humor your child. Act like you see their friend that walks beside them. Play like you see them too. Talk to them. No, that's not any good. The child knows you don't see those beings. So,
Mhm.
you don't trick the child. My policy is never lie to a child. Now, sometimes you have to put it in language they can understand, but never, ever lie to a child because that's what turns them against the world. And as I told you before, what woke me up, somewhere between age 7 and 9 was realizing that most people don't align their thinking, feeling, and willing. And what it looks like is everybody's lying.
Mm.
They're just coping with materialism and coping with the fact that they don't see the unseen world. So you just have to be completely honest with the child and give them the best answer. And the best questions I've ever received in my life that led me to the greatest insights came from children.
Hmm. I know this is a little bit off topic, but this issue of drugs to children, how do you think that as an educator that emerged and why did it emerge? Why did we start drugging all of our children?
Because materialism is all based upon drugs, and doctors are materialists in most cases if they're allopathic doctors, regular standard doctors. A naturopath might give them a homeopathic remedy, which will actually cause them to get well instead of basically squelching the symptom and not getting anywhere near the cause. And why did that happen? Educators will tell you, they'll do an assessment on a child and tell them they have ADD or ADHD. Impossible. Impossible. They're not medical doctors. And by the way, there is no test to determine that a child is that way. Usually we used to call them hyper, they're just hyperactive. And after a while, they grow out of it. One of the best things you can do for those children is, strangely enough, I'll give you two things to do with them, which is not medical advice. It's an advice from an educator. Give them a hot breakfast in the morning made out of oats or buckwheat. Buckwheat is even better than oats. Give them something heavy in the morning so that their digestion system gets activated, the blood goes to their stomach, and it takes it out of their head. Now, if the child is really severely hyperactive, then you can, strangely enough, you have to get a certain type of coffee, either Cafe Altura or Mount Hagen, both created by friends of mine who created a biodynamic, low acid coffee. And you give it to them straight up, no milk, no sugar. That will make it do the opposite. And why is that? A child sees the complementary colors. We see the color for what it is. A child sees the opposite color up until 9. They just emotionally, they can see it, they can see the color as we see it, but the experience on them emotionally is the opposite. Same thing with, that's the reason they give
Can I
Ritalin.
stop you there? So you said opposite color. So what's the opposite color of red, for example?
Green.
Okay.
Or well, actually, going into green, the technically, what you want to do is get not strong colors for the child. You want to give very diffuse pastel colors. And so the best color you can do for a child when they're young is magenta. And then they experience something towards the effect of green towards blue, which
Hmm.
actually enlivens them. It doesn't make them hyper. You would think it would make them hyper because it's red. No, it's the opposite. So you go with the opposite colors.
Hmm.
So we actually have colors that we paint each classroom with the color that is appropriate to that age. And
Wow.
so when
That's
you give
interesting.
Ritalin, remember Ritalin is a stimulant. Well, why would you give a child a stimulant? Because it acts in the exact opposite direction for a child than it does for an adult.
So what is the aim function of all these doctors who give all this chemistry out to children? What are they trying to achieve? Just placidity?
They're trying to stop the symptoms at the cost of the child's health. And that's true with all drugs in America. A placebo is more effective than most of the pills that they give you. Placebos are effective in 51% of the case, which shows that your mind controls your body, your spirit controls your soul.
Hmm.
And that's the kind of the opposite of what a doctor would think. But they are trained to be total diehard materialists. They don't study a living body, they study dead bodies. They don't study healthy organs, they study sick organs. So the number one cause of death in America is iatrogenic, according to many people. According to just allopathic medicine, it's the third leading cause of death in America, doctor induced death, iatrogenic. And sadly enough, that's the age that we're in, that doctors don't, they're trained so poorly and they're turned into such materialists, and they look towards death and fear instead of life and love and hope. What doctor is going to say to you, oh, there's nothing wrong with you, this is just what people go through, what you just need is more love, and turn to the parent and say, just give them more love. But in most cases, that's exactly what they need, and that's exactly what heals them.
So as a child, if you met one of these doctors, these materialistic doctors, uh, what would you see? Would you see a demon? What would you see?
You'd see Leviathan. You see the demon of basically envy. Most materialism is because people envy things. And when you envy things, it means that you think you're not complete and you want something somebody else has. Well, that's what all doctors are. And what do they want? Most of them want money, and they want to practice, and they want to be able to charge huge amounts of money. That's the reason the most materialistic doctors become surgeons. But if you talk to them on the side and you ask them questions and nobody's listening, they're going to tell you the same things I'm telling you. For instance, most men, I forget what the percentage is, I think it's 85% of men in America above age 65 have prostate cancer. If you talk to a doctor, they'll treat it as cancer. But if you talk to a naturopathic doctor or somebody who's awake and knows what they're talking about, they'll say, oh, wait a while, the cancer goes away. And it may come back again and it'll go away. But we don't need to give you radiation and chemotherapy. That is nothing that a doctor will ever tell you. Matter of fact, doctors will tell you that vaccines work. There's no evidence whatsoever any vaccine has ever worked. Sorry. But in my opinion, and I've watched this because as a superintendent, as a principal, and as a teacher, I was responsible for all the vaccinations of children in the school. And I can tell you that the vaccinations in every case that I've ever seen, when the child comes in after vaccination, I can look at them and they are having brain fever. You can see it in
So
their
you
eyes.
were a clairvoyant when you were doing this, when you
Yes.
were, and you had these 10,000 students, and they were required to take vaccines. And how did you respond to that? It must have been quite difficult.
I made sure that everyone knew that they had, in those days, a religious and a philosophical right to say no vaccinations for my children. That no longer exists in this state. Only a religious exemption will work. But I'm the person who changed the way that vaccinations work in juvenile detention facilities across America. Because what was happening, we would have basically pandemics. They'd have outbreaks of all the very things that they gave the children shots for. So if you came in and you didn't have a good shot record, they would give you all the shots up to that day. Say you're 16, they'd give you all the shots that you were supposed to have as quickly as they could because they thought they were trying to save the people in the juvenile detention facility from getting those things. So the point is that you need to always let things work out. For instance, if your child gets a fever, the first thing people want to do is give them aspirin to take the fever down. No, don't do that. The fever's there to actually strengthen their immune system. When I was young and when you were young, if somebody got measles, what did we do? The
My
parents went
mom took us to get exposed.
to rub on that person. You had to go over and we had 7 children in the family. We all had to go rub on the person who had German measles,
I
who
remember
had
doing that.
any of those childhood illnesses, which actually strengthen your immune system. So, you know, that's what I recommend, that you simply let things oftentimes just work themselves out with the child. Now, if the child has 105 fever, well, then put them into a cold water bath. You could also put, strangely enough, you're not going to believe these things, but it's the truth. I've seen it happen hundreds of times. Take an onion, raw onion, cut it up, and strap it onto the calves of their leg. And usually the fever will go down. But you don't want to do that until the time comes that the child has strengthened themselves through the fever. Fever is a good thing. It gets rid of the very illnesses that they supposedly try to immunize against.
So what's the uh, in this issue of angels and demons, um, and sickness? When you encountered somebody that was sick, what did you see as a child? Now, up to 14, what did you see from the sick person?
Now that gets very bizarre, but I'll tell you the way that I see it. And I know that this is also true for other clairvoyants. When you see an illness, you usually know whether the illness is temporary, whether it can be eradicated, or whether it's what we call karmic illness that cannot be healed. The great healer, one of the greatest healers of our time, Dascalus, said the same thing. He would not enter in, he would ask for a picture of someone. So they'd send a picture, they'd tell what the illness is, he'd look at the picture and he'd go, nope, I can't help this person. This is a
Hmm.
karmic illness. For somebody else, he would do a healing right there and affect it even at a distance. Matter of fact, when I was ill from being exposed to the volcano fumes in Hawaii, friends of mine sent a picture of me to Dascalus, and boom, literally, right, he worked on it, worked on me, and I got healed from that. And
Wait,
we,
what do you mean worked on you?
well, he heals at a distance, and he is an amazing healer. And Paul Scorpin was one of his top students, and he described these things. Dascalus would sit around when he in a quiet mood and he would create these balls of light of different colors and he'd store them up in the corner of the room And when the time came that he needed to heal someone, either from a distance by looking at a picture or in front of them, he would simply reach up, grab the right color ball, bring it down, and put it into the person, and they would be healed. Or he'd touch
What,
them.
what do you mean, put it into the person?
He'd
You're
take that
saying,
ball of light, which he had created out of his intention, and he would make the ball of light go into their heart.
hmm. Okay, so you used a bunch of terms there. Created from his intention. What does that mean?
Well, his intention was to heal people. And so he took all of his love and all of his grace and mercy and his virtues and put it into different colored balls, which related to, they look like ball lightning. And they just sit there and kind of spin around, kind of rotate around. And they would stay there until he wouldn't need to use them. They'd stay there for as long as he needed them to be. So a healer has to make sure that they have prayed, that they've oftentimes fasted, that they keep themselves pure, that they have to be selfless. If they are selfish, they can't heal anybody. And so you have to do that, and the way you do that is, of course, by prayer and meditation, and the contemplation, concentration, these exercises that you can do to focus your energy so that it can become tangible in the physical world, or at least pseudo tangible in the physical world, so that it can then enter into someone's body. Now, did the other people in the room see the balls of light, the balls of color as he would pass them into their body? No. Did other clairvoyants in the room see them? Yes.
Well, as you said that, I was recalling one of the scriptures where the apostles were praying for somebody to heal them, and they weren't seeing anything, and so they brought that person to Christ, and Christ did heal them, and they asked him, why could did our prayers not cause the healing? And he said, these can only come out by prayer and fasting.
Yes.
Now, I would have assumed, I've always thought about that. I would have assumed that the apostles would have been doing that. So, did you think Christ was meaning something specific about the issue of prayer and fasting? Because that sounds like what you're saying.
Healing and getting rid of demonic obsession or possession are a little bit different. And so, as you know, when they couldn't cast out the demon, they called Christ, and Christ cast the demon into some pigs, wasn't it? And they ran
Mm-hmm.
off the cliff.
The Gadarene swine.
That's
Mm-hmm.
it. And so, unfortunately, in that case, those animals had to be sacrificed for the possession to end. But generally, you cast that demon back to where he comes from, which is into the subterranean realms of the earth, um, with Christ's help. No one can do it on their own. So it's a little bit different. So when you
So,
heal,
in other words, the abyss.
the more or less, yes, the abyss, not the
Mm.
permanent hell, fire of hell, because remember, a lot of evil is here just for a certain period of time, and then it's transformed. It's actually redeemed. So evil has, strangely enough, in the long run, sometimes a good purpose, and that's very hard to figure out.
Yeah, that
Uh,
is.
but in terms of healing, that's one thing. If someone's obsessed, that means the demon isn't inside of them necessarily. But if they are possessed, nobody uh, would want someone to be possessed. And possession doesn't come as a karmic illness, it comes from your own action and opening yourself to those influences willingly.
I want to get to Father William, but you just said something, karmic illness. What's
Mm-hmm.
that?
The illness that can't be healed, that the child may have come in so that they will die at an early age, let's say, for instance, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Why? Because in their previous incarnation, they only needed to add one more piece to the puzzle, and that piece to the puzzle could only come from fantastic suffering. And once they have gone through that suffering, that may be all they need to do karmically in this life, and then they leave. And there's no healer that can heal them necessarily.
Hmm.
And that is not the sins of the father visited upon the children. That's different. This is karmic illness, and the karmic illness can have a good purpose.
So, since you brought that up, what we've noticed with these uh, Babylonian Rhodanites, these ancient demons, is that they pass their banking trade down through their blood lineage. And are they passing a demon from father to son, father to
Yes,
daughter?
yes, that's what
And
Christ was talking about.
at what point does that happen in that child's life?
Well, first off, the evil possessed father or mother teaches the child to allow this demon so that it's so common that it's part of their life. And then the child is trained to want this demon. And
Mm.
and of course, as you know, you could be born into a evil banking family and still not be evil because you reject it. But if you follow along with the teachings and the beliefs and the actions of your parents who are in fact possessed by the demon of mammon, worshiping money, then highly likely you're going to worship money. I'll give you one example. I've known some of the richest people around, and their children are horrible. They're monstrous. One particular family, because the old man wouldn't die, demanded to have their inheritance now. And so he gave each of them, I think it was $100 million.
Oh man.
They came back
Wow.
shortly thereafter and needed more. Why? Because they were in the grips of mammon.
Hmm. And that's not all the children's, that's certain of the children.
Correct. You don't have to, you could be born into the most evil family in the world and still come out to be a saint.
Hmm. There's often stories of saints who were born into wealth, and at some point in their life, they realized the futility of that and actually became great saints of the church.
Some of the most saintly people I know were people who were quadriplegic or born with horrible, horrible illnesses that did take their life early on. And yet they're the cheeriest, happiest, most wonderful people. And you think, oh my goodness, if I had that happen to me, I'd turn into a monster. But no, for some reason, they came in because they're saints and they have tremendous suffering, not for this life, but for the next life, and not because of some karmic debt they owe. No, there's a lot of paying forward that goes on with karma. And you have to be able to distinguish that, or else when you try to heal somebody that has willingly taken that on, they're not going to heal and you're not going to be effective.
Hmm. When you met Father William, his last name is Bresnahan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and he at that time the chief exorcist of the Roman Catholic Church in the United States?
Yes. And at
Okay.
that time, there was one on the East Coast, one in the West, and one in the middle. And because he had more experience at training priests, and because he was raised up to that position when he um, supposedly contracted polio and was in a wheelchair and went to St. John's Hospital, where they sent from the entire state, actually a multi-state area, they'd send the most difficult people that had come to priests to this psych ward, the psychological ward in St. John's Hospital. And it was a huge ward. And so he would get all these people there, and they had rooms where he literally did exorcisms. And he was the chief exorcist at the time, yes.
Do all hospitals have that understanding of mental illness, or only Roman Catholic hospitals?
Just spiritually founded hospitals. Some of them might be, founded by Lutherans or by Presbyterians
Mhm.
or whatever. But in general, they don't have much of a rite of exorcism. They have just, general prayers. And so they know that the priests in the Catholic Church have been doing this for centuries. And so they send them there. And
Mm.
strangely enough, when I was handling 10,000 students a year, I had um, special wards in a hospital where the most difficult children no one else
Excuse
could
me.
handle. I had the most difficult children that no one could handle in a three-state area sent there, not because they knew me or anything, it's just because we were the only ones willing to take them. And so I got a lot of those children when I was in my last job, where I was working for this company handling so many difficult children, the expelled children, the permanently suspended children, the adjudicated youth, the mentally ill, supposedly mentally ill, psychologically ill children. So I got to see a lot of them, and it was like going back home, when I was a young person working with Father William, because
Mm.
these children do things that you can't
Mm.
believe. I could tell you stories, you'd go, no, that's not even possible. But it, I had one guy who no one could handle, and they would have to strap him down until I came in the room, and that he was perfectly peaceful. You could see a demon in one of his eyes and not a demon in the other. So you could see
Mm.
the struggle going on in his being, right? But he had superhuman strength. I came into the room one time, and there were these are the people that we had working in these wards. Big people, big guys, strong, as strong as anyone you've ever seen, huge, because some of these children were big, right? And so I walked in, they called me, they said, "We have an emergency down in the ward." So I went down there, and I walking down the hall, and I'm hearing what sounds like World War III going on in the room. So I go in, and he's got an entire cabinet picked up over his head, and he's getting ready to throw throw it at 5 guys on the floor that he had already
Wow.
thrown chairs at, everything. He's got this gigantic thing. I mean, I don't even know how he could lift it up. But as soon as he saw me, he just dropped it behind me. He says, "Hi, Dr. Gabriel." And he'd always start up exactly where our conversation ended last time. When last time when we were talking, and we'd sit down and have a lovely conversation, and the guys on the floor were bloody and they were terrified. Everybody's terrified, right? I mean, they've got the police, they've called the police, and I go in, and the guy just, because I loved him, right? I accepted him for what he was. And I could say, "Well, you do know that, on one side of your head, there's this demon, and it's really trying to take over your body." He goes, "I know. Every night I go through this." And he'd tell me what he was going through. So they tried to drug him up, but sometimes he wouldn't take his pills, and then crazy things would happen. But he's just one case. I've seen literally hundreds
So
of
were
cases like that.
that was in your 14 to 18 time frame?
No, this was my last job.
Oh, your last
For
job.
10 years, I worked with these children,
Oh.
every adjudicated youth in the county, and then some. And all kinds of problem children, whatever they were, I got them. I was the
So
superintendent.
when you and Father William were a team, um, did he start taking you on his rounds immediately at 14?
Well, he first showed me how to stop people screaming in pain who even morphine wouldn't stop. And so he taught me those prayers. He taught me those. They're kind of like tricks, but not really. They're just straightforward exorcism stuff, And so I'm going, oh, good Lord,
Oh,
if he
well,
can do
wait
this.
a second. What do you mean straightforward exorcism stuff?
We
I mean, what is that?
well, you make the spiritual circle and you call in the Trinity, and then you start the rite of
Well, can
exorcism.
you slow down, please? Because most of us have never seen this. Okay, so you're saying that there were certain rituals like liturgies that you would engage in,
Yes.
uh, and you knew over time from experience, or he knew, that those had an effect on the demon you were dealing with?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And you say there's a circle?
Yes. You take a chalk and you create a circle that does not have any breaks in it. If it's got a break in it, you could be in huge trouble. So you create a sacred ground, Timonos, the sacred ground, and you make this
No, I
circle.
don't know. Temenos, what's that?
This means Greek for sacred ground, holy
Oh,
ground,
okay. Hmm.
because you're in a room with, and this person might have been doing, I'm not going to describe the horrible things, but they could have been doing such horrible things that no one even will go in that room,
Doing horrible things in their lives or in that room?
in that room
Oh, wow.
with, multiple demons screaming out of their body,
Really?
projectile vomiting, throwing
Mm.
stuff around, what people would call poltergeists, attacking anyone who comes in the room, and then many, many other horrible things I
You
won't
mean
describe.
things like we see in some of these movies where objects are floating in the air, things like that?
Yes,
That's real?
that's totally real.
Wow.
They also
Okay.
float themselves. I had one case. that Father William had to call me in really early on when I was young, and I because the girl had a comb. I think, didn't I tell this story? The comb that would comb
You
her
did
hair,
with
and
John.
she,
You told
yeah,
that story.
and it didn't, she didn't touch it. The comb was possessed too, because it was the comb that her mother would comb her hair with, and then her mother got killed by her father, and then she killed her father. So imagine. And so the bed that she was in, a big hospital bed, was moving, and it was squishing. It actually literally squished and ruined his wheelchair, squished him up against the wall, and was so powerful that it bent the metal. And it was going to squish him, and he was trying to climb out of the wheelchair. And I don't know where he was going, because he looked like he was going to jump out the window. So he sent me a mental note. I came up immediately and uh, started a different process, because I could see the one he had done what didn't work. And there was a reason for that. I won't go into that, but yes, he would take me on his. Some of the rounds were not in the psych ward. We had to go to the home of the person, or we'd have to go to the dioceses where this person was, because sometimes these people who are possessed seem absolutely normal. They go to
Mhm.
school, there's no problem, but then something happens and they get into that space, and horrifying things happen. And I mean,
So
it is
you
terrifying.
you indicated that these demons can possess either people or objects.
Well, they shoot it out of themselves into the objects. And once they have trained that object, then the object is just part of them. And yes, and they do horrible things. They desecrate. One of the things they love to do is you hold a cross when you're in the circle, and you're supposed to memorize this prayer, which is these different prayers. And that's why, Father William had a photographic memory, and I pretty much did in those days too, because you don't have time to look down at a book and read it.
Right.
Because the cross in your hand it's as if a demon is trying to take it out of your hand. And they will take that cross, and with their hand, even though we use a metal cross, squish it, which human can actually do. Or they would take the cross and then they would desecrate the cross. You can, whatever you imagining right now, it's that and worse. So they would desecrate the cross, or they'd try to take the cross off your neck if you were wearing the cross, or they'd try to rip your clothes off your body, or they would have things like that's why you have to clear a room before you do an exorcism, because anything in the room they could use as a projectile, like a
When you say
poltergeist.
clear, what do you mean? Take
Take everything out
objects
of the
out of the
room.
room? Okay.
Everything. Matter of fact, the place we usually would do it would be in a padded room.
Really?
Yes, because they will throw things at you and kill you. And so all these people who watch movies that are complete nonsense, or they tell you their parish priest is doing an exorcism for the whole congregation, that's complete garbage. If you've ever seen an exorcism, it will
Right.
change your life permanently, and you may never recover.
Well, okay. So we at every service pray the Lord's Prayer, and in the Lord's Prayer, one of the prayers is "Deliver us from evil," and that is something that every Christian prays. So you're saying the demonic possession and exorcism is different than that prayer?
Yeah, that's just a general prayer. It didn't identify a specific demon. It didn't figure out why the demon had, or demons had entered into the body. It didn't get the person to admit it and state that they want it out. None of that happens when you're in a general congregation and you're doing, your standard prayer, the Nicene Creed or whatever.
Hmm.
So it's quite different, 100% different.
Okay. Yeah. So you're in the midst of this. You've done certain liturgical rites associated with So you're taking this seriously, and you're realizing that there's something really wrong here. And so then when you encounter difficulties, or Father William encountered difficulties, how do you respond to that? It sounds like it's a judgment call right at the moment.
Yes. and only experience can really get you through. For instance, the exorcism that you hear, The Exorcist, the movie, was
Mhm.
all wrong, but he was the priest who actually went to the East Coast and worked with both the East Coast, West Coast, and himself, the central exorcist. And they went to, I think it was Pennsylvania. I think the girl was from New York. They had it all wrong. So, don't reference the movie The Exorcist and think you're seeing something that is the way that it is. But both of the two other priests, they gave up. He had to be there for months. The nuns, because they did this in a convent, half of the nuns gave up the habit. They gave up being a nun to
Wow.
leave. And the village that was nearby, the people could hear the screaming and these demonic screams coming from the convent, to the point that many of the people, they just left the town until it was over. And so Father William, it was up high, and I know this because they filmed it. They filmed some of these things, and this one was filmed because it was such a bad case, lasted so long. Nobody seemed to be able to get very far with it.
Did I miss something? Are you saying that The Exorcist was based roughly on a story about Father William?
Correct.
Oh,
And they'll
wow.
tell you it's another priest. Incorrect. And they'll
Hmm.
tell you that, I think they even changed the sex, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't. I watched The Exorcist a long, long time ago and said, well, that's a bunch of garbage. No, what happened in that particular case was probably the worst one that I've ever heard of. So Father William was driving down the mountain, and something picked up his car and threw it off the road, and he tumbled down the mountain, and probably because he's a very holy spiritual man, it landed on the wheels again, but flattened the wheels, crushed the car, and he survived. But that's the kind of power that can happen. There's no limit to um, what a botched exorcism can create for the people who are involved in it.
Hmm. Wow. So, with that, was he ultimately able to, in that case, exorcise the demon?
Yes. The problem was they thought they were dealing with one demon, Asmodeus, but they were dealing with 7 demons. And until they identified all of them, got them to say their name, because the demon will actually, if you can, and the person wants to let go of the demon will actually, the last thing they want you to know is their name and their sigil. But when they're leaving, they will scream sometimes their name at you. And so he got one of the demons out, the demon Asmodeus, but he couldn't get the demon of wrath, Satan, out of her until later. And so it took a long time. It took months, and it almost killed him. But in the end, all 7 demons left. The girl came back to normal and was perfectly normal the rest of her life.
And this was after you worked with him or before?
It was before I started working with him when I was 14, and before he was in a wheelchair.
Was that somehow associated with him going into a wheelchair?
I don't know. Your research about Father William brought all kinds of things to light that I didn't know, because he never talked about himself. He was the most humble, selfless person I ever met.
No, I cannot. Almost found nothing. There were a few writings by certain priests that claim to be exorcists, but almost nothing out there. So it sounds like something nobody ever writes about.
Because they don't have the experience. Matter of fact, the head exorcist in Rome, as I've said before, he's possessed, literally. So the head priest in the Catholic Church is possessed. Well, how is he helping anybody? Now, there was a movie made not too long ago that was fairly accurate. I forget the name of it. But in general, unless they had somebody who was well experienced in this, anything they're going to tell you is just made up poppycock.
Hmm. Hmm. So Father William is taking you on these rounds, and is he consciously thinking that you're going to be an exorcist, or is he still wondering if you're going to be an exorcist?
He knew when he baptized me at my birth that I was to be his replacement. That's what he
Hmm.
told me. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, do I get a choice in any of this? And then we find out, of course, the truth of the matter is the reason that I'm the way I am is because of him, because your research demonstrated. And then my sister gave me some missing pieces of the puzzle, and we finally figured out that, of course, and the reason that he was in the wheelchair, there was a reason, because he wasn't pure, and the reason that he couldn't exercise some very tough cases is because he was not pure. And I won't go much further than that in describing why. But the point is, I was very young. I didn't know anything. I was pure as driven snow. I was, very. I didn't even integrate with the world. I wasn't integrated with the world. I was separate and would rather go into a dark closet than interact with people. But eventually, when I turned 14 and I got my feet on the ground, he was able to say, "Okay, I've come to claim you for the church." When I was 14 in my dad's hospital room, he wheeled in the wheelchair and said, "Douglas Jude Gabriel, I've come to claim you," and he did, and that was that.
Hmm. So you were educated in this very esoteric skill, gift. I think you don't consider it a gift. You've said sometimes you consider it a curse,
Absolutely.
but you're able to see things in the unseen world that most of us. Okay, so let me ask you about intuition. Um, a lot of people talk about intuition, things they kind of sense or see. How does that relate to being clairvoyant, and how does that relate to dealing with demons?
Intuition is love, pure love. And intuitions are 100% correct, always, or else it's not an intuition. So when you say, women's intuition, or I'm having an intuition, or whatever, no, no, no. An intuition causes you to do something because you hear the word of God speaking through you pretty much as you're doing it. And so an intuition is far beyond spiritual imagination or spiritual inspiration.
So it shouldn't be discounted.
Which, an intuition?
If you're having intuition about some subject, you shouldn't discount it and say, nah, maybe that's just coincidence.
A lot of counseling I've done is to let people know that they need to believe their first intuition. So when you're asked a question, if you get an instantaneous answer that makes you want to get up and do something for other people, in other words, give love, don't discount it. It's
Mhm.
because an intuition is not you, it's God working through you. And so, yes, everything we were doing for exorcism was an attempt to align ourselves with pure intuition so that we would be using the voice of Christ, the Logos, the Word, to speak through us as a vessel so that then the Holy Trinity could come in and bring forth the name of the demon, how it got there, and convince the person who is possessed that they don't want to be possessed anymore. And then when it happens, if you think you did it, then you better never try it again because you didn't really do it. You were acting by a direct impulse of the spiritual world through intuition.
Hmm.
It's a little bit past our time that we should probably wrap up. Do you have any final question?
Well, I have one uh, if you want to take it, and that is encounter somebody. You said you could see the unseen world around this person. Does that apply to things like people's photos?
Yes. You can certainly see the spirit of a person looking out from a photo if you're clairvoyant. Um, Same thing with clairaudience. If you hear them speak, you can have your eyes closed. You can hear a recording, and you can know a great deal about their soul. And with intuition, you can just say a person's name, and a true intuitive can tell you all about them by just hearing their name. Not with hearing their voice, not with seeing a picture of them. So yes, as the American Indians believed, when you take a photo, it captures part of their spirit,
Hmm.
and that's true.
Yeah, I've always sensed that, and since we've been doing so much investigation of these Babylonian Rhodonites and seeing their photos, it gets pretty easy over time to see uh, evil in an individual. Or the other thing that's uncanny is that when these people are gathered together, which they like to gather in groups, they like to show themselves in a photo set of 50 or 100 people. You see that same countenance in all of them. And it's like you don't see good people amidst these groups. And so that's what we see now in a lot of corporate uh, boards, in the officers in a corporation. You look at most banks, and then you see the people. They all like to get on their list of photos with their biographies, and you can just see to a man and woman uh, that group is evil. Uh, that's what it appears like to me. I don't see the unseen part of this, I guess. But what do you see now, since you say you're not clairvoyant like you were before?
Well, that's very that doesn't even really take clairvoyance. The desire body of the person is expressed through their face. So if they have bad desires, it starts to change their face. Matter of fact, somebody said that on Facebook that they had known my work and they respected that, but until they heard me speak and see my face, then she says, once I saw that, I knew you were a good person. Everybody has that experience, right? You can look at a picture, and it used to be like Dascalus, you hand him a picture and he could tell you everything about that person, what their illness was, where it came from, so on and so forth, all kinds of stuff like that. So yes, all you had to do in the old days is hand me a picture. I could look at it and say, I guess you want me to tell you about this person's husband, John, right? Well, John did this and that and this and that. And so, yes, you can, from a picture, you can pick up the true spiritual imprint of a person.
Yeah, I tested that. I had a shareholder come in I hadn't seen in a long time, and we were doing our investigation of that Gillenhammer Rothschild executive up in Sweden. And I mean, he just has evil written all over his face. And I had the picture sitting on my desk. And I said, here's a good example of one of these people that attacked us and stole our technology. He looked at that photo. And he didn't see anything. He said, what's wrong with him? He looks like a good businessman.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
And people look at you and they always say, oh, he's such a good moral person. I mean, they can just look at you and tell, right? And especially if you're sensitive, the second that I'd meet a person, I could tell you all about him. But I wouldn't do that unless I had their agreement for me to drop my shields and look at them. So that's how I would protect myself because I was a reader for for decades, and so I would I always had to ask somebody, "Do you really want me to give you a reading? Do you really want me to look into your soul?"
Hmm.
And if they didn't say yes, I didn't do it, and I didn't look at them. But sometimes you can't help it because it comes shooting at you, and certainly the second you see someone's face, there's no shield that can stop you from seeing the desire body, the animal body of that person coming through their face.
Mm-hmm.
So, Michael, this is
Well, thank you,
always
Douglas.
enlightening for me to see what questions you're going to ask because people don't understand that perhaps that these are spontaneous questions you're asking me, which is what I like. I like the spontaneous questions and I like the difficult questions. And I like you boring down to get to an explanation that isn't this world instead of from some other world, because other people, they don't, even necessarily acknowledge that unseen world. And so what, I might say is just some glib remark uh, really needs to be brought down into the practical application realm. And that's the beauty of what you're doing here in these conversations. So we will do this again soon. I don't know when.
Good.
We'll talk to to the big boss, who is not in the unseen world. She's in the seen world, and she'll let us know when we'll have another chance to do this. And soon, John Barnwell will be back, and we'll be picking up the series where he left off. But I don't think we should drop this series with you and I because people are getting a completely different feel from it and a completely different experience. And so I think that it's very, very useful. And for me, it's really good just to get these things off my chest, as they say, and
Well,
especially with someone who's my best friend.
I enjoy it, and I appreciate you being so open.
You and John are such good companions. You're such best friends because you've put up with me for years and years, and I say crazy things all the time, and you're like, "Oh, what does that even mean?"
Well, let me put it this way: you're about the only guy on the planet I could have called the day we discovered the Babylonian Radonites, and you would have said, "What are you talking about?" That's what way most people would respond. But you said, "Whoa, wait a second," using your background and your knowledge of history to realize that we had seized on a historic truth.
You have opened the biggest can of worms in economic history, and it has filtered down into basically soul slavery, spirit slavery, and physical slavery of people. So, what we're trying to do is help people help themselves free themselves from this slavery. And that is certainly
Amen.
the work of demons.
And humanity is grateful for your experience here.